15 years ago, Darius Holloway was a struggling black single father when he found an 18-year-old homeless girl sleeping beneath a Baltimore train station. Everyone told him to walk away because he barely had enough money to take care of himself. Instead, Darius gave Savannah Prescott a warm meal, a room, and eventually his own last name. Years passed, and Darius quietly built a $900 million empire while Savannah disappeared from the corporate spotlight entirely. Then, in one brutal week, his banks froze billions, his board turned against him, and his own chief executive demanded his resignation. Darius had lost everything until Savannah walked into the emergency meeting carrying a single black folder. Stay close, because the girl Darius once saved was about to reveal who had really stolen his empire. Baltimore, one December night, the air cold enough to bite through denim. Darius Holloway was 42 years old, then working for a small accounting firm that was quietly circling the drain, and he lived alone in a rented two-bedroom house on the working-class west side of the city. People who knew him called him a single father, though few of them understood how his family had actually come apart, and fewer still ever heard him speak of it. He was a quiet man, the kind who wore the same worn jacket through 3 winters and drove a sedan that had crossed the 10-year mark without complaint, and nobody in that neighborhood would have guessed he had once been one of the sharpest financial minds in the city. That night, walking home from the office, under a hard December sky, Darius passed the train station and saw a teenage girl sitting beneath the overhang, hunched over a torn financial newspaper with a pencil in her hand. She was not begging. She held no sign, made no sound, asked nothing of the people hurrying past her. She simply sat there circling numbers in yesterday's stock listings, as though she were solving a puzzle only she could see. And something about the stillness of her concentration made Darius stop walking. The station smelled of wet concrete and diesel, and the wind coming off the harbor cut straight through his old jacket. But Darius found himself standing there anyway, unable to simply keep walking, the way everyone else that evening had. He had grown up in this same city in a house not far from where he now stood, raised by a mother who cleaned office buildings at night, and a father who left before Darius turned 6. And he understood better than most what it felt like to be looked through rather than looked at. He asked her why she was reading yesterday's prices when the market had already moved on. She did not look up. Yesterday is where people hide today's mistakes, she said, and the answer landed on him like a struck bell. Darius lowered himself onto the cold step beside her, and she pointed to 3 companies buried in the listings, explaining that all 3 shared an identical pattern in their cash flow just before their stock prices collapsed. He checked her math against what he remembered from his own analysis at the firm, and she was right more precise than the entire research team he worked alongside every day. He bought her dinner that night, a small kindness that asked for nothing in return. He did not press her about why she was homeless, did not offer pity dressed up as concern, did not lecture her about the dangers of the street. He simply set a spare key on the table between them and told her that if she needed somewhere warm to sleep, the room was hers for the night. She studied him with the wariness of someone who had been disappointed too many times to trust an open hand, and asked him plainly what he wanted from her. Nothing, he told her. Everyone wants something. She answered bitterness, worn smooth by repetition. Then prove me wrong in the morning, he said, and walked out into the cold without waiting for her response. She came to the house that night, and one night became a week, and a week stretched quietly into 3 months. Darius helped her sort out identification papers, enrolled her back into school, and slowly built a kind of stability around her that she had not known in years. Eventually, it was Savannah who asked the harder question, wanting to know if he truly considered her family or simply a project he had taken pity on. And Darius answered by beginning the legal process to adopt her as his daughter, a grown woman, choosing a father as much as he was choosing her. When the lawyer Graham Bellamy laid the final papers on the table, Savannah stared at her new name, printed in black ink, Savannah Holloway, and asked Darius why he had chosen her out of everyone he could have walked past that night. Because someone should have stopped for you, he told her, and he did not explain that many years earlier. He too had waited for someone to stop, and no one ever had. Graham, who had known Darius since the 2 of them were young men trying to build something out of nothing, watched the signing with a quiet kind of pride he rarely allowed himself to show. He had drafted 1,000 contracts over the course of his career, mergers worth hundreds of millions of dollars, dissolutions that ended marriages and partnerships alike. But he would later say that this particular signature on this particular evening was the one that stayed with him the longest. Savannah did not cry, and neither did Darius, but something passed between them in that small office that neither man in the room needed to name aloud. The night she signed those papers after she had gone to bed, Darius opened a small safe hidden in his bedroom closet and sat alone with a stack of old financial files he had not touched in years. On the cover of the first folder in faded government stamping were the words "Meridian Collapse Confidential," and he stared at that folder for a long time before finally closing the safe again. He understood, sitting there in the dark, that he had just brought a rare kind of genius into his home. And he understood something else, too. Something heavier. That the past he had buried so carefully might not stay buried forever. 3 years passed, and Savannah made her way through college on scholarship, but what unsettled her professors was never her grades. It was the way she read a financial statement, seeing not the revenue line everyone else circled, but the quiet shift in a footnote buried on the final page. Not the profit everyone else celebrated, but the precise moment money had actually changed hands. Darius trained her himself quietly, every evening at the kitchen table, laying out the collapsed companies of years past without ever telling her their names or their outcomes, asking her only one question each time: where did the lie begin? In the beginning, it took her 3 days to find the answer. Then it took 3 hours. By the end, it took her 17 minutes. And somewhere in that progression, Savannah began to suspect that no ordinary accountant could have taught her these instincts. She started noticing small things about him too. The way his hands sometimes hovered over certain pages a moment too long. The way he never once mentioned a former employer by name. The way he flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever a news segment mentioned corporate fraud, investigations. She filed these observations away, the same way she filed away financial patterns quietly, without comment, waiting for the day the pieces would finally connect. She asked him directly what he had done, before she knew him, and Darius offered only a short, worn sentence he used to fix companies. The truth was far larger than that. A decade before their paths crossed, Darius had been the youngest strategist inside a secretive team that specialized in rescuing corporations from the edge of collapse, and in his prime, he had saved billions of dollars in assets that would otherwise have evaporated overnight. But after a catastrophe known only inside certain circles, as the Meridian collapsed, Darius vanished from the financial world entirely, his name quietly scrubbed from records that once carried it with pride. He told Savannah none of this. Instead, he simply started a small company of his own, calling it Holloway Meridian Capital, seated with just $47,000 and a stubborn belief that broken businesses deserved a second look before they were written off. Savannah once asked him why he had chosen the word Meridian for the company name, and Darius said nothing at all. The firm bought failing businesses nobody else wanted. Small factories, struggling, transport companies, half-empty warehouses, and rather than gutting them for parts, Darius rebuilt their systems from the inside, with Savannah quietly, helping him read the numbers long before she ever held an undring official title. In their first year, they rescued 3 companies from the brink. By the 3rd year, the firm was worth $38 million. By the 5th year, it had grown to $170 million, a trajectory that startled even the bankers who had once dismissed Darius as a man clinging to a used sedan and a modest row house. But, as the company grew larger, Darius made a decision that broke something between them. He pulled Savannah away from the daily operations, telling her only that she needed to build a life of her own outside his shadow. She heard those words as rejection, as proof that he no longer trusted her judgment the way he once had. And the argument that followed was the first real fracture in their relationship. Savannah left Baltimore not long after, taking a position overseas, investigating corporate fraud. And before she boarded her flight, she told him one last thing: "You saved me, but you never let me save you." Darius had no answer for her that night, and she left without one. 7 years after Savannah walked away, Holloway Meridian Group had grown into a $900 million empire, and Darius Holloway's face appeared on the cover of a respected business magazine, a man who had built a fortune from nothing more than patience and a sharp eye for value others overlooked. But the figure standing just behind his shoulder in that photograph was not his daughter. It was the company's celebrated new chief executive, a woman named Meredith Caldwell, poised and polished in a way Darius never had been. And locked inside Meredith's private safe, unknown to anyone at the company, sat a copy of the very same file Darius had hidden away years earlier, the one stamped Meridian Collapse. Meredith Caldwell had joined Holloway Meridian when the company was worth $240 million, already a celebrated name. In her own right, a Harvard-trained executive who had twice pulled failing companies back from bankruptcy and appeared often on financial television as a voice of calm authority. She and Darius were opposites in nearly every way that mattered. He distrusted the press. She understood exactly how to use it. He built value through discipline and cash flow. She built it through narrative and market confidence. Together, over 6 years, they carried the company to its $900 million valuation, and the board adored her. The banks trusted her instincts, and investors had begun quietly referring to her as the true face of Holloway. Meridian. Meredith had not come from wealth either, though she rarely mentioned it. She had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a factory foreman, and she had clawed her way into rooms that were never built to welcome her, learning early that competence alone was never quite enough, that presentation and timing mattered just as much as the numbers underneath them. In many ways, she and Darius had walked similar roads to reach the same boardroom, yet they had arrived with entirely different beliefs about what the climb had earned them. Darius believed the company belonged to whoever protected it best. Meredith had come to believe it belonged to whoever built its future, and by her own measure, that person was her. But Darius still held final control, and that fact began to eat at Meredith in ways she rarely allowed herself to show. In one board meeting, she proposed issuing additional shares to fuel faster growth, and Darius refused. She pushed for a $600 million loan to acquire a logistics conglomerate, and again he refused. She asked him with barely concealed frustration whether he trusted her at all, and Darius answered simply that he trusted numbers. "Numbers don't build empires," she told him. "They tell you when empires are dying," he replied, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence that neither of them broke. From that day forward, Meredith began quietly assembling allies inside the board of directors, and in private, she began meeting with a man named Preston Langford, the patient and dangerous chairman of a rival investment fund who preferred to dismantle companies from within, rather than confront them openly. Their plan was elegant in its cruelty. They would not steal Holloway Meridian outright. They would engineer its collapse from the inside, then acquire the wreckage at a fraction of its worth. Meredith supplied internal data. Preston applied pressure on the banks, and the only obstacle standing in their way was Darius Holloway's uncanny ability to sense fraud before it fully surfaced. To move past him, Meredith needed leverage from his own history, and eventually she found the Meridian collapse file, believing it held a secret large enough to destroy his reputation for good. One Monday morning, Darius arrived at his own headquarters to find his access badge no longer worked. The security guard at the front desk looked at him with visible confusion, unsure what to say to the man whose name was on the building. Darius called Meredith directly, and she answered with unsettling calm, telling him only that the board was waiting for him upstairs. When he walked into the conference room, 12 members of the board were already seated, and on the screen behind them glowed a single figure in red $2.1 billion in exposure. Meredith slid a folder across the table toward him. It was labeled simply, Resignation Agreement. Meredith announced to the board that Holloway Meridian was facing hidden financial obligations, totaling $2.1 billion a number, so staggering that 3 banks froze the company's credit lines within hours, and 2 major partners canceled long-standing contracts before the fashion's buy day was even over. Darius demanded to see the raw data behind the figure, and Meredith refused, insisting that an internal investigation had already been completed without him. The board voted to place Darius on immediate leave, and by the time he left the building, television cameras were already crowded outside, which told him everything he needed to know. The crisis had not simply happened. It had been prepared, timed, and released before he ever set foot in that room. Over the following 3 days, the media transformed Darius from a respected founder into a suspected villain, with headlines accusing him of concealing enormous debt and one television segment openly asking whether his empire had been an illusion worth $900 million all along. Meredith appeared before the cameras herself, careful never to directly accuse him of wrongdoing, offering instead a single practice line about her responsibility being to protect the company, a sentence crafted to sound like restraint while doing the work of an accusation. Reporters camped outside the Baltimore house Darius had lived in for over a decade, and neighbors who had known him only as the quiet man with the old sedan suddenly found microphones pushed toward their faces, asked to comment on a man they barely knew beyond his habit of shoveling snow off the sidewalks up and down the block each winter. Employees at Holloway Meridian, many of whom Darius had personally hired out of failing companies years earlier, watched their retirement accounts shrink alongside the falling stock price, and whispers began circulating through the offices that the founder they once trusted might have built his empire on a foundation of sand. On the 5th day, Preston Langford submitted a formal offer to acquire Holloway Meridian for $190 million, a fraction of its former worth, and Darius understood immediately that he was witnessing a takeover disguised as a rescue. He had no proof yet, only instinct sharpened by years of watching numbers lie. Graham Bellamy combed through the company's loan agreements and found the trap buried in the fine print. If the company's valuation fell below a certain threshold within 10 days, the board would be legally forced to liquidate assets to cover the debt. They had only 72 hours left before that threshold would likely be crossed. Darius tried calling Savannah, but her old number no longer connected, and the emails he sent into the silence went unanswered. That night, Darius sat alone in the old house in Baltimore, in the room that had once belonged to Savannah, which he had never brought himself to change. He opened a drawer and found the pencil she had used that first night at the train station, worn down to a stub from years of use before she left it behind. And he remembered the words she had said to him then, that yesterday is where people hide today's mistakes. He stared at that pencil for a long while before rising to his feet, driven by something he could not quite name, and returned to the office the next morning, demanding to see records from 7 years earlier. Meredith laughed at the request, telling him he was looking backward while his empire burned around him. That's usually where the fire starts. He answered quietly and walked past her without waiting for a response. Far away in Zurich, Savannah Holloway sat in front of a financial news broadcast, watching her father's face fill the screen beneath a chyron announcing the $2.1 billion crisis engulfing his company. She studied the way the debt had been categorized, the specific structure of how the obligations were split and layered across the company's filings, and something about the pattern struck her as immediately unmistakably familiar. She had seen this exact architecture before, 15 years earlier, buried inside the anonymous training exercises Darius used to hand her across their kitchen table. Savannah closed her laptop without another thought and booked the first available flight back to Baltimore. The final emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning, and Meredith intended to use it to push through a vote authorizing the sale of Holloway Meridian to Preston Langford's fund. Darius sat at the far end of the table, stripped of his title, locked out of the company's data systems, entirely listening, as Meredith told the room that the man who built this company might now be the greatest threat to what he had built, and several board members nodded along in agreement. Then the door to the conference room opened, and a woman walked in wearing a plain black coat, pulling a small travel case behind her, a single dark folder tucked beneath her arm. Meredith frowned and asked who she was. The woman looked past her straight at Darius, and he rose from his chair before she even spoke her name. Savannah. She looked different than the girl who had left Baltimore 7 years earlier, older around the eyes, steadier in the shoulders, dressed in the plain, unhurried confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to a room full of strangers. 15 years had passed since that cold night at the train station, and now Savannah set her folder down on the polished table and introduced herself plainly as Savannah Holloway, before turning to face Meredith directly. "I believe your $2.1 billion debt does not exist," she said, and the room went utterly silent. Meredith laughed and ordered security to escort the intruder out, but Graham stepped in immediately to stop them, reminding the board that Darius had quietly transferred a block of non-voting shares into a Holloway family trust years earlier shares, for which Savannah was the legal beneficiary, granting her every right to stand in that room. Savannah opened her folder, and rather than presenting a single damning document, she laid out 4,218 individual transactions, each one legally unremarkable on its own, yet together forming an unmistakable pattern she called the mirror ledger, a system designed to fabricate financial obligations by recording the same underlying risk again and again across a web of interconnected subsidiaries. Meredith's confident expression drained away in an instant. Savannah projected a diagram onto the screen behind her, showing the full scope of what she had found: 4,218 transactions, routed through 31 shell companies and 9 different banks, every path of 2. Money eventually converging on a single name. It was not Preston Langford's name at the center, and it was not Meredith Caldwell's either. Savannah turned to face her father directly. "Dad," she said, "this began before your company ever existed." On the screen behind her, in stark white letters, appeared the words, "Meridian Collapse, 18 years earlier." Darius had no choice left but to tell the truth in full. 18 years earlier, he had not been an ordinary accountant at all, but the youngest senior strategist at a firm called Meridian Strategic Recovery, tasked with investigating a major conglomerate teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. During that investigation, Darius uncovered the very same mirror ledger system Savannah had just laid bare on the boardroom screen, but before his report could ever be published, the underlying data mysteriously vanished, and 3 senior executives quietly redirected all suspicion onto him. Darius was never formally charged with any crime, yet his reputation was destroyed all the same, and he walked away from finance entirely, rather than fight a battle he could not win on paper. Meredith asked him, in a voice stripped of its usual sharpness, why he had never told anyone this history. "Because surviving a lie does not mean you want to live inside it for the rest of your life," he answered. Savannah finally understood something that had confused her for years. The anonymous training exercises Darius used to give her at their kitchen table had never been random case studies at all. They had been built directly from the case that destroyed his career, though he had never once asked her to investigate it or avenge it on his behalf. He had simply wanted her to have a different life, free from the wreckage of his own. Savannah looked at him and said quietly that he had not pushed her away because he stopped trusting her judgment, but because he had been trying to protect her from exactly this moment. Darius admitted it was true, explaining that he had discovered years earlier that Meredith was actively searching for the Meridian Collapse file, and that fear alone was why he had forced Savannah out of the company for her own safety. She was still angry that he had made that decision without her, but there was no time left to argue. Only 36 hours remained before the board's forced vote to sell the company. Savannah dove into the mirror ledger data, while Darius worked through the corporate structures layered on top of it, the two of them working side by side for the first time in years, falling back into the same rhythm they had shared at that kitchen table so long ago. Darius asked her the old question once more: where did the lie begin? This time Savannah answered without hesitation. It did not begin with Meredith at all. She traced the earliest transaction in the entire system back 18 years, and the name listed as its original approver was Preston Langford. But it was the second signature on that same document that made Darius go completely still, because it belonged to the very man who had once served as his mentor at Meridian Strategic Recovery, a man everyone had assumed was long retired, and whom the records now showed was still very much alive. To prove the mirror ledger had been deliberately engineered rather than accidentally created, Savannah and Darius needed the original source data, not merely the pattern they had already reconstructed. Darius remembered that Meridian Strategic Recovery had once kept a redundant data archive on an independent server, and Graham managed to trace that old server to a decommissioned data facility in rural Pennsylvania. Savannah and Darius drove there together, through the night, the radio off. The highway empty, except for long-haul trucks, moving through the darkness. Neither of them saying much, because there was nothing left to say that the silence did not already carry. The facility itself had been stripped down to a single unused wing rows of dead server racks coated in a decade of dust, and the technician who let them in seemed more surprised that anyone still remembered the place existed than curious about why they had come. When they finally located the storage drive, it was nearly corrupted beyond use, its files locked behind an old encryption scheme that Darius recognized instantly because he was the one who had designed it nearly 2 decades earlier. "You built the lock," Savannah said, studying him. "Then you find the key," he answered. And together they worked out that the unusual transaction dates buried in the data formed the exact decryption sequence needed to break it open. Inside the unlocked archive sat Darius's original report from 18 years before, proving beyond doubt that Preston Langford had been running the mirror ledger scheme for nearly 2 decades, manufacturing false crises to drive down the value of struggling companies before quietly buying them out and stripping them for parts. Holloway Meridian had simply become his largest and most ambitious target yet. But the data also revealed something Savannah had not expected. Meredith had not fully understood what she was participating in. Preston had convinced her that Darius himself was the original architect of the mirror ledger, and Meredith genuinely believed she was protecting the company by removing a dangerous founder from power. That belief did not erase her guilt, since she had knowingly leaked internal data and broken every duty she owed the company, but it changed the shape of what came next. Savannah called Meredith directly and told her plainly that Preston had lied to her. Meredith said nothing at first, but 3 minutes after Savannah sent her a single file from the archive, she called back. Her voice completely changed. "What do you need?" she asked. The truth, Savannah told her, in front of the board. Only 12 hours remained. Preston had built his entire career on patience, on waiting years for the right moment to strike, rather than months, and he had never once imagined that the man he considered a relic of a bygone era might have a daughter capable of outmaneuvering him in a single night. Sensing that his scheme had been uncovered, Preston moved to protect himself by notifying the banks that if Holloway Meridian failed to repay $480 million by 9 o'clock the following morning, the company's pledged assets would be seized. Immediately, Darius asked Savannah whether there was any way to stop it in time, and she told him plainly that there was not. He fell silent, bracing for the worst, until Savannah allowed herself a small, dangerous smile. "We cannot stop it," she said, "but we can make him believe he has already won." Savannah built a plan that hinged entirely on Preston's own greed. Holloway Meridian would not pay the $480 million, and they would let Preston trigger his right to seize the pledged collateral exactly as he intended. But before that seizure could take effect, Savannah quietly reclassified the underlying assets according to the precise terms of the original loan agreement terms. Preston had never bothered to read closely because he assumed victory was already assured. He believed he was about to inherit the most valuable divisions of the company. In reality, the collateral clause only granted him control over the specific legal entities directly tied to the debt itself, and Savannah proved that all 31 of those entities were nothing more than empty shell companies holding no factories, no real estate, and no actual revenue of any kind. When Preston triggered the seizure using his own electronic signature, he unknowingly attached his name permanently to the entire fraudulent mirror ledger network he had spent 18 years building. At 9:01, the banks received the full report. By 9:07, financial regulators had already opened a formal investigation. By 9:14, 3 separate banks lifted their freeze on Holloway Meridian's credit. By 9:22, Preston Langford's $190 million acquisition offer had been formally withdrawn. Meredith walked into the board meeting that followed and admitted without excuses or deflection that she had passed internal data to Preston Langford. believing at the time that she was protecting the company from Darius himself. "I was wrong," she told the room, looking directly at him before placing her executive credentials on the table and resigning on the spot, her voice steady, even as her hands were not the composure that had carried her through a decade of boardrooms, finally cracking in front of the very people who had once trusted her most. The board turned to Savannah and asked, almost in disbelief, where she had learned to read a financial system with such precision. Under a kitchen light, she told them in a two-bedroom house in Baltimore. The immediate crisis had ended, but Savannah realized one problem still remained unsolved. Holloway Meridian had survived Preston's attack, yet the company's market value had already collapsed by more than 60%, and panicked investors were preparing to sell at the market's opening the following morning. If confidence was not restored immediately, the $900 million empire could still crumble under the weight of fear alone. "We exposed the lie," Darius said, allowing himself a moment of relief. Savannah shook her head. "Now we have to make them believe the truth," she told him. Savannah proposed holding a public press conference to address investors, journalists, and the banks directly, and the remaining board members hesitated, pointing out that she held no executive title, no formal spokesperson role, no public profile of any kind. Darius overruled every objection with 4 simple words: "Let her speak." Darius watched from the side of the stage, remembering another room decades earlier where he had stood, accused and silent, unable to find the words that might have saved him. He had never had someone stand beside him in that moment, and now he understood, watching his daughter straighten her shoulders before stepping into the light, that this was the difference between the two of them, the difference that would decide everything. Savannah walked out in front of a room, crowded with reporters and television cameras, and she opened, not with numbers, but with a single sentence no one in that room expected to hear. 15 years ago, she said, "I had no address of my own." The room fell completely silent. She spoke briefly about that cold night at the Baltimore train station, careful never to lean on pity or spectacle, and explained instead the principle Darius had taught her in the years that followed, that true value does not disappear simply because someone else has priced it wrong. From there, Savannah walked the room through the real financial health of Holloway Meridian, factory by factory, contract by contract, asset by asset, proving that the company had never actually lost $2.1 billion at all, that its cash flow remained strongly positive, its holdings entirely real, and its growth intact across 14 consecutive quarters. She revealed the mirror ledger scheme publicly, but she refused to turn her statement into a performance of revenge against those who had wronged her family. "My father did not build a $900 million empire by making numbers look valuable," she said, closing her remarks. "He built it by finding value everyone else chose to ignore." She paused before her final line. "That is exactly how he found me." Darius lowered his head, unable to hide what he felt for the first time in years, while behind her the room absorbed the full weight of what she had just said. The markets responded within hours. Banks restored the company's credit lines in full. 2 major investment funds canceled their sell orders, and one of the company's largest partners chose to extend its contract rather than walk away. Holloway Meridian had survived. 3 days later, the board summoned Darius and formally offered to reinstate him as chief executive, and he refused. Instead, he placed a single folder on the table in front of them, naming his choice for the company's next leader, Savannah Holloway. She turned to him in disbelief, telling him quietly that he could not be serious. Darius only smiled. "You once told me I never let you save me," he said, sliding the folder across the table toward her. "I think we are even now." 6 months later, Savannah Holloway was officially confirmed as chief executive of Holloway Meridian Group, and she did not chase the kind of glamour so many expected of a company that size. Her very first decision was to create an independent risk investigation division within the company, one with the authority to challenge any executive decision, including her own, without exception. Meredith Caldwell cooperated fully with the ongoing investigation that followed, and though her career and reputation suffered lasting damage, her testimony proved essential in unraveling the full scope of Preston Langford's network. Preston himself came under formal investigation for a string of manipulated acquisitions spanning nearly 2 decades, and within a year, Holloway Meridian's value had climbed past $1.1 billion higher than it had ever stood before the crisis began. Yet Darius largely stepped away from the business world he had once dominated. He returned to his quiet life in Baltimore, and one rainy evening Savannah found him standing at the very train station where they had first met so many years before. The station had been renovated since then, the old bench where she once sat with her torn newspaper long since removed, replaced by clean modern seating that held no memory of that night at all. Savannah stood beside him and asked whether he ever wondered what might have happened if he had never stopped that evening. Darius said no. Surprised, she asked him why. "Because I did stop," he told her, and neither of them said anything else for a long moment. Savannah reached into her coat and drew out an old, worn-down pencil, the very one she had left behind 15 years earlier, and that Darius had kept safe ever since. She placed it gently in his hand. He asked if she did not want it back for herself. "I do not need it anymore," she told him, smiling. "I already know where the lie begins." Darius laughed softly, the sound of a man finally at peace. Before they left the station that night, Savannah noticed a new sign mounted on the building across the street, the Holloway Second Chance Foundation, an organization built to help homeless adults 18 years and older gain access to building across the street, education, stable employment, and real financial training. Darius had quietly funded it, using the majority of his personal dividends, never once mentioning it to her. When she asked why he had kept it secret, his answer was simple. "Somebody should stop for them," he said. And Savannah recognized the words instantly, the exact sentence he had spoken to her 15 years earlier on a cold December night. Neither of them would ever forget. She thought of all the nights since then, when she had wondered whether that night had been an accident of timing. One tired man, simply too soft-hearted to walk past a stranger in the cold, and she understood now that it had never been on accident at all. It had been a decision he made again and again quietly, without an audience, long before the world ever knew his name. That night, so long ago, Darius had believed he was simply offering a spare room to a homeless girl with nowhere else to go. He had no way of knowing she would one day become the very person who saved his $900 million empire from ruin. But Savannah understood something else entirely, something Darius himself had never fully said aloud. He had not helped her because he recognized a genius sitting in the cold. He had helped her before he ever knew what she was capable of at all. And that distinction, quiet and unremarkable as it seemed, was the truest measure of who he had always been. Somewhere behind them, the city moved on, the way cities always do, indifferent to the small miracles that occasionally happen inside them. And Darius found himself thinking not of the $900 million, nor the board members, nor the reporters who had once camped outside his door, but simply of a pencil worn down to a stub, and a girl who had once refused to believe that anyone could want nothing from her. He had spent so many years afraid that the past would come back to ruin him, never once imagining that it would be the very thing that saved him, instead wearing the face of the daughter he had chosen on a night when he had almost nothing left to give. Real kindness was never an investment, after all. It asked for no return, demanded no repayment, expected nothing in exchange for what it gave. And yet, 15 years later, when the whole world had turned its back on one tired, honest man, the only person still standing beside him was the very person he had once stopped in the cold to help. Never measure a person's worth by the place where you happen to find them. Sometimes the one the world walks past today becomes the only one capable of saving everything tomorrow.